The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mary Crow, Director of Professional and Community Education at Care Dimensions. Welcome to today's webinar on anticipatory grief, what it is and what can help. So before we get started, Let me just check. I want to make sure. Okay, so the sound is good. If people are having some trouble, I'll guide you through that. So if you've joined the presentation using your computer speaker system by default and you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information is displayed. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send, you can get in touch with Hope Drysdale, H. Drysdale, Drysdale at caredimensions.org. You can also try to send a message through the chat, and Hope will try to retrieve that. So it's just sometimes people will send me the messages, and I am not looking at emails and such right now. So so if you can do that, but we'll try to help you if there's any technical difficulties. So we will do our best to answer text questions, and so if you send those in, we will try to do that at the end, if time permits. So I'm going to start the presentation, and then at the just so that you know, at the end of the program, you're going to be getting a hold on before you sign out at the end, because then what happens is if you go too early, sometimes the evaluation doesn't get triggered to go. So if you just hold on, and then the program will end, the evaluation will come to you, and you return that to me, and then I'll get the certificates out. On the evaluation, there are 2 yes or no questions, and what they're asking is, did I disclose this information to you? So there's no conflict of interest for this program, no commercial support, doing this for educational reasons, and in this particular program, there's no off-label med use, which can happen in hospice care. So, like I said, those 2 questions are yes and yes, because it's asking, did I say those things to you? So, by the time we're done, and we do have CEUs, by the way, nursing, social work, certified case management, and certificates of attendance for everybody else. So this program, we want to focus on, and we'll go through anticipatory grief and defining that and what that means. We're going to talk about grief in general, too, about factors that affect how we grieve. And we're going to certainly look at some useful tips to help people who are going through this and what would help. So let's jump in. Like I said, there's a lot to talk about here. So, grief is just, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's a necessary phenomenon. It's a painful phenomenon, but we certainly need to do it. So, grief are those internal feelings that we experience when we have a loss. And mourning, you hear these words, grief and mourning mourning is where grief are the internal feelings. Mourning is the outward expression of grief. So, we grieve. We grieve, and it's anyone who has an attachment will grieve when facing its loss. So facing a loss can happen at the actual time of the loss, or when we suspect that we're going to lose something. We human beings, right? We are certainly pack animals, aren't we, right? We have this genetic wiring to form bonds. Most people do, right from the time of birth, right? We form these bonds. But life is full of losses, large ones and small ones, and so therefore, it's likely and it happens that most human beings feel grief at some point or another. Certainly some more than other, but there's certainly a lot of grief that people can go through. We could be free from grief if we never formed attachments, but a life free from attachments would be very difficult, if not impossible. So, many of us think of grief as being a response to the loss of a person. It's more than that. It's more than that. It's a much more complicated and complex phenomenon. And we'll talk about the multiple types of losses. So, when you're grappling with any kind of loss, you're involved in that grief process, even again if that loss isn't tangible. So we'll go through those losses. I want to talk for a minute right now, though, about, just what we're going through right now. I always feel like I just don't want to skip over the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic here. So, there's a lot to be grieving right now with the COVID-19 breakout, right? This pandemic outbreak. There's certainly a collective loss. This is unique in a lot of ways, and there's this collective loss of normalcy. And for many of us, there's a loss of a sense of connection, a routine, and even in the uncertainty about the future. Some have lost jobs and even loved ones in this. And, so there's also for some people this lingering sense that more loss is still to come. And, that sense of fearful anticipation is called the anticipatory grief. And it can really be a doozy, can it? So I just want to bring that up because, certainly what we're talking about this morning, I'm kind of doing a broad overview of anticipatory grief. I'd be remiss in not bringing this up about what we're experiencing right now, like I said, as a collective in terms of the grief process that's happening and certainly how people are managing on an individual or personal level with the losses that they're experiencing. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of attachment. When I said it's not just about a person, but there's many attachments that we form. And, we form attachments to concrete things, to people, to ideas. And these are some examples that you see here. Our attachments change over time, right? As we develop and change, our ideas develop and change, and our attachments can wax and wane too. There is literature that suggests that as we age, our attachments lessen in relationship to just understanding how the finality of life. So I think a lot of you can attest to the fact that, geez, we kind of, our priorities get realigned, don't they? And, sometimes, again, it's less of the materialistic things that we experience and that we form those attachments to, and even some more so to people and not just family, but other people that we consider part of our group and our family that we become connected to. So I think, again, they're constantly adjusting in terms of our attachments. There are no right or wrongs in terms of the attachments. And, sometimes even people, the attachments to their hopes and dreams can even be stronger than maybe necessarily an attachment to a person. And like I said, there's no right or wrong. We grieve the losses of any of these things, whether or not we're even conscious about the attachment. So it's important to assess the how strong the attachment is, because it's not always apparent with the type of relationship that it is. And I think sometimes it can really take us off guard. That's not an exhaustive list of attachments either, right? Those are broad categories. So there's always so much more. So let's talk more about grief in general. I'm going to just put these out on the slide for you while we're talking about these. Grief is, and this word normal, I don't use it a lot because we can't measure it, but, it's not an uncommon. It is natural, right, for us to have this, a natural process. And grief is hard work. It takes a lot of energy. I always say that, a lot of times people think of grief as this kind of quiet, silent, passive type of process, but it's so much more than that. This is hard work. And for people who are grieving, it's, I'll tell you, it takes every ounce of energy, it seems, right? You go into survival mode. And so you can see that grief can be physically, psychologically, and spiritually demanding. And everybody grieves in different ways, so it's so important that we don't judge people based on how they're grieving. There's so many reasons why we grieve differently, right? We're different people, but certainly our cultural differences come into play here too. And I always say it's not just culture, is not just about ethnicity, it's about so much more than that. And whether it be religion or our own family cultures or our age and gender and this, again, the list goes on and on. So really important that, again, we don't judge in terms of how others are grieving. And, grieving openly doesn't mean that you love the person more. Some people hide or conceal their feelings. And that's the way that they do it. So it's important that we understand and honor and respect that too. Let's talk about this, some more of the factors that shape how we grieve too. Again, I'm going to just list these out. I think it would be easier for you to see. Distress is an understandable response, isn't it? to the many losses that can occur along the journey of life. Particularly like if people have, there's news about a life-limiting illness, and that affects not just the individual, the individual patient, but the family as well. So while many individuals and family members, I feel that they manage with remarkable courage and strength, and there's a number of risk factors that can make some individuals more vulnerable than others for distress. And that can include a number of things, whether it's your age, even having younger children, not having a partner, or there being social isolation. But even for people that aren't alone, there could be ongoing relationship difficulties. Even, again, what is their mental health like? What is their physical health like? Maybe that's poor, or there might be other life stresses in addition to the progression of a life-limiting or a terminal illness that can precipitate that type of distress too. Patients or individuals without close relatives or friends, they depend on healthcare workers for their support, right? So, it's like psychological distress, depression, anxiety are very common amongst caregivers as well as among individuals themselves. So it's not uncommon that a patient or an individual's partner or family members provide a lot of that informal care in terms of the emotional and the practical support, and even helping with decision making. So you can see there's so many things like how did the loss happen? Was it sudden or traumatic? What is the relationship? Is there a strong bond there, or is it a complicated relationship? What were the circumstances around that loss? Things can get so complicated. Was it sudden? Like I said, was it here when you have the opportunity in terms of that anticipatory grief? We talked about the personality of an individual comes into play, how they manage stress in general, how have they reacted to prior losses. But so many social variables, the cultural things that I had talked about earlier are coming into here as well. So, certainly, anticipatory grief is the process of experiencing those, again, is that, in normal phases of bereavement in advance of the loss of something significant. And again, if it's a person, so, this encompasses mourning and coping and planning and, even the psychosocial reorganization that has to begin here, right? It gets stimulated to begin, because what happens is that we're doing that in response to awareness of an impending loss, usually a death, but again, in recognition of other losses too. And that's a big part of this as well, right? Because it's not just the loss at that time, it's the losses around the past, the present, and the future. And I will talk more about that. So, anticipatory grief is believed to have various aspects and occur in various stages. So, specifically, the process of anticipatory grief can follow the general process of experience like shock about the upcoming loss, denying the reality, and at some point the acceptance. And the acceptance is just coming to the understanding or the realization. It doesn't mean you're happy about that or that it's just you come to an acceptance that this is what's happening. So anticipatory grief does change over time. But anticipatory grief, it's viewed as, it can be viewed as a mental process too, in terms of adapting or deal with an individual's illness or death, not just merely a reaction to it too, that arises over time. So, anticipatory grief, it's interesting because, some people have even questioned whether anticipatory grief is real, which, again, I feel it's very real. It's very much there, but, some people will sometimes question some of this stuff when in fact, it's necessary. And it's very much a concept that people experience. So, I think that the concept of anticipatory grief is becoming more widely studied and better understood in relation to a number of different diseases. And, I'll talk a little, I want to go into a little bit, even focusing just for a second around Alzheimer's and dementia, but this is about all diseases that this can affect. So, sometimes the word anticipatory grief, it's used interchangeably with terms, in the literature, like around like pre-death grief or preparatory grief. So again, anticipatory grief can occur in response to numerous losses. It can even be around loss of personal freedom, changes in roles, worry about the future, loss of relationships, loss of aspects of a person's personality. It can be experienced, like I said, by a person facing the life-limiting illness or the loved ones that are there with them. So, it can be with anticipatory grief too. It can actually have a higher intensity of anger sometimes than the grief that people can experience after death. People with that, because of that loss of emotional control, and it can even come up as like an atypical grief. It can, so it can get complicated for people. Although grief is often associated with death, receiving the diagnosis of a terminal illness for oneself or for others, it can just unleash an onslaught of feelings, right, of emotions for the individual and the caregivers. The sorrow, the grief, the fear, the anger, anxiety, it just fills the time, right, between the diagnosis and the time the actually death occurs or the loss of that person. Teresa Rando is, somebody who does a lot of work in this area, and, she defines anticipatory grief as the phenomenon encompassing the process of mourning, coping, interaction, planning, and psychosocial reorganization that's stimulated as part of a process in response to the awareness of an impending death of a loved one. And just in recognition, too, that there's associated losses when somebody has a diagnosis like this, a life-limiting illness, around the past, present, and future. I just wanted to say something for a minute too, just around anticipatory grief and dementia. Like I said, I'm not minimizing any other disease processes, but certainly this can be kind of a unique anticipatory grief. So among caregivers of people with dementia, it's common, obviously for, you can have negative health outcomes, for caregivers on a number of different reasons, just by virtue, just the length of the disease process, certainly. So, there's a report of gradual losses as dementia progresses, including loss of intimacy and companionship. Other losses, too, related to caregiving role, such as, again, the personal freedom that people can feel, even social or occupational opportunities, because caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's is just, if you haven't read the 36-hour day, I highly recommend it, but it's just constant. It's around the clock. So, there's that too. So even recreational opportunities, role identity, and health, that can all affect those caregivers. They have done a systematic review and found that 47 to 71% of dementia caregivers experienced anticipatory grief, and revealed that anticipatory grief is actually more common and more serious in dementia caregivers than caregivers with people of other terminal illnesses. So again, on that unresolved anticipatory grief can have negative impacts on mental health, physical health, social relationships of the caregivers, and really can put people at a higher risk of developing complicated or prolonged grief after the death, of the care recipient. So I think that it's important that we just pay attention to that. This, just in terms of this too, there's when we have a loved one who has a life-limiting illness, there's a distinction, right? Because we still have that interaction and all. And I think some of the other distinctions in terms of people with Alzheimer's and dementia is, when people have that gradual loss of cognitive function, in people with dementia, there's a decreased level of that emotional reward that people can experience, like by the family or the caregivers. So, that inability to even resolve conflicts or share feelings, having that more, interactive or didactic experience that that you have, that I think it's really hard for people because of the loss of intimacy and the mutuality. Certainly, I feel that in terms of my relationship with, with my own mother with Alzheimer's, that there's, I miss that. I miss that mutuality, that exchange. And that can be really hard for people. So, and I think the other piece too is, that sometimes what can add to the grief that a caregiver feels, certainly with a person with dementia, it's not always openly acknowledged or publicly mourned or socially supported when you're talking about kind of the grief or the anticipatory grief here. So I think sometimes people refrain from even talking about it. So I just wanted to, just go into a little more detail. And certainly, again, it's with all illnesses, but we can see that some illnesses, there are some unique differences as well. So, in terms of anticipatory grief, we absolutely grieve from the moment we realize, right, that, that a loss is going to happen. So there are many factors involved in realizing that. Denial often surfaces when an impending loss is first felt. That grief can also deepen as various implications of the loss become clear. So, even like that, the looming loss of like a spouse is grieved and then grieved again when there are like financial implications or lifestyle implications, even the parenting implications there. So, you can see that the grief is kind of like ongoing throughout this process. So from the moment a diagnosis is given, grief begins, the grieving begins. So, even a search for other opinions, cures, treatments, day-to-day concerns can set the grieving aside for a little bit. But, even just, another interaction or dose of bad news can trigger another bout of grieving. Particularly again with people with life-limiting or when they're giving, serious illness diagnosis. So that realization can make that grieving cycle over and over, right? And then even the realization that, geez, dad won't live to see a child graduate or, even events like that. While anticipatory grief, it doesn't reduce the amount of grieving that needs to happen. But, what happens with this, because people think, well, why don't I not feel better when the actual loss occurs? Why am I hurting so badly when I hoped that I would feel better? And what good is this anticipatory grief, right? Is what I hear from people. Well, I'll tell you, it doesn't mean that the grief that we experience when the actual loss occurs is just as significant. It doesn't lessen the blow, in other words. But what I do feel anticipatory grief is very helpful because I feel like it kind of gives us tools for our tool belt. It's like that we're kind of using and calling on some of the things that we have found helpful during that anticipatory grieving period to utilize when the actual death occurs. Just list these out for you too. So, we grieve people long before they die. Grieving, like I said, not just the what is, but the person's former self as there are changes. And like I said, these losses are on a daily basis, right? It's not just at the very end. So I think people just need to be aware with that. And so it's this, knowing what is coming is certainly just as painful as the loss itself. So I think people have to be given an opportunity. That's where this narrative approach comes in, right? Where people are able to tell their stories and to talk about it and to emote. I think that there's no greater gift that you can give a person than to be able to do that. And it's really important that they are able to work through it and to process things in that way. So again, just for anticipatory grief, knowing again, I want to make sure people really see that this is about not just when the death is expected, but it's before it happens, that it's not just from the caregivers, that it's also experienced by the individual who is dying too. This is kind of preparation, right? You're getting ready of all the losses that you're going to experience when that person actually dies. Anticipatory grief is helpful, right? Because this is time to finish things. I always say that, dying is such a a personal experience. And there's a lot to do at this time of life that we call dying. And some of that is by finishing unfinished business, being able to have closure in a lot of ways and reconcile and making amends, all of that. So it's important. And, we often view death is just a medical event, but as we talk about in hospice care, it's so much more than that, right? This, grief and death and grief and all of that, and certainly anticipatory grief, there are mental components, emotional, cultural, social responses to this, and everybody's going to do it differently, and it's really important, again, that we honor and respect that and those differences. So some of those common signs that people can experience, certainly the physical stuff that comes up were not uncommon, right? The sleep difficulties, even some of the physical stuff, headaches, exhaustion, loss of appetite. Here I am, I'm telling you, grief is hard work, and you can see it just sucks you dry, doesn't it? But this is where we have to, we really got to make a concerted effort. Like we have to, there's an intention, right, that we have to set in terms of grieving. But you can see, you can have these physical symptoms, and it's scary for people, so to have these, and you can actually feel like you're going crazy, or you yourself are going to die when you start to experience some of these things. So it's important that people are aware of that. And it's also important that, that you don't minimize or ignore feelings too, because you don't want to miss, if you're having a medical issue, you don't want to miss that too. So it's always good to get checked out and making sure that, medical stuff is rolled out, and that, again, this is, you can see if this is that more of the grief process that one's experiencing, but some people just write it off, and you want to be careful about that too. But behavioral stuff too is, withdrawing. Some people start to withdraw, spending, sometimes people do more time, and sometimes people kind of, are truly withdrawing and coming away, spending less time. I think people need to talk about it. It's hard because family members or loved ones are so different, aren't they? Some need to talk about it and what the death may look like, or how this is going to play out, and others just, they don't want to talk about it at all. Again, crying or inability to cry, there's no right or wrong. These are, people are different in this way, so it's important that we not judge based on that. And some people, they keep busy, right? And they just, they try everything they can to deflect the feelings of, it's just too painful sometimes. So they try to avoid the feelings. So they're keeping busy to kind of deflect that. Some of the emotional things that people can experience, the sadness, the guilt, very common, aren't they? So anxiety, helplessness, anger, yearning, overwhelm, self-blame, very common things that come up emotionally for people. Cognitively, people, when they're grieving, absolutely. So they have difficulty concentrating, desperate for information sometimes, right? Just wanting to know, trying to, sometimes I see that too as, you're just trying to, you get controlling even, right? Because there's so little you can control about a person's illness sometimes that you kind of go into, more controlling phase and trying to get a handle on that, trying to control what we can't. But that's why it's important that we do control the things that we're able to, right? To just give us some sense of that. But, we're constantly trying to control the things we have no control over. And even the worry about the what ifs. Not uncommon in this. How do you not? But it's important that we kind of focus on the minute, because we can spend so much time worrying about the what if that we're losing time too, and that precious time that we share together at this critical time. So, absolutely, it's important to grieve in all the stages. Before, during, after. So it's important to really pay attention and to give the time for that. So, what are some of the caregiver losses? Because there are a lot of losses that caregivers experience. I'm going to list these out again for you. As a result of having someone who is, has a life-threatening illness, a life-limiting or serious illness. So, Psychological distress is very common. In people who have, certainly we see this in our palliative care patients and their families, people that have life-limiting illnesses. One study reported that over half of the partners will experience symptoms of psychological distress and a quarter will have severe symptoms. And symptoms can include a number of things, whether it be fear or loneliness, isolation, that sense of helplessness, lifestyle disruption, uncertainty, struggling with the impending death. So, for patients and families, the news that a cure or remission is no longer possible is devastating and can be totally overwhelming. There's certainly an accumulation of losses as the person's illness progresses, including, their physical strength and well-being be reducing and becoming minimized in that way. This and the implications of a life-limiting illness, increasing physical dependency, inability to feed, dress, or bathe oneself, to meet personal needs unaided, the psychological burden. So, this increased dependence on others, and even when the curtailment of activities, inability to work or maintain roles. These are all really painful adjustments for the individual and for the family. Spiritual or existential issues can also be raised at this time, right? Confronting what the purpose of life is, and just about death and about suffering. People really start to question a lot of those things. So it's important to take the time and to be able to process this. That's why I always love when people are able to get on to hospice and palliative care so much sooner, because this is a lot of work is done on a lot of these things. But it's not always the way it works too. But it's important that people realize that you can see again, this, the loss of the future as people imagined it, the financial security. That's a worry for people, and it's hard because you're focused on your loved one and the fact that you'll be losing them and missing them and all, and then it's important. You can't help but worry about the financial status and all of this, but even sleep and family harmony. People deal with things in different ways. And I always say, crisis or health crisis can actually pull families together, but it can also fracture families too, and even more than sometimes they're already fractured. Even just the chore thing, which is on this list. I've had family members say this to me, that I had a woman in the husband had end-stage Alzheimer's disease, and she said, I just want him to be able to take the garbage out, and it wasn't that she was just didn't want to take the garbage out. It was what it symbolized for her. They had these shared chores and or chore division, and that was his thing that he did, and she really missed that, and just wanted to be able to share some of those things and to have that done, and you could really understand. So, certainly, again, it's so important to identify the losses and the feelings, because, again, we can't hold this stuff in. We've got to be able to understand. And, let's look at why it's important to identify these losses and the feelings. And, so if you don't, when we kind of bury our feelings, boy, they come out in other ways, right? So, they can be angry outbursts or, they creep over us, and certainly when we hold anger in, again, it can, we could have depression or other feelings of hopelessness from it. So very important that we are able to do that. It doesn't mean all the time. You have to have some time where you have distraction and diversion, but at the same time, we can't always push the grief down. We have to have opportunity to express our feelings, our worries, and let these come out, and otherwise it's going to creep up. It's going to come out another way. So, like I said, when these things, it gives opportunity for deeper communication, right, and sharing at this precious time, rather than just getting, short with one another and kind of and angry and all of these other things. So this can be something much more of a growth experience or a healing, as opposed to something that can really turn into a more negative expression. So it's really important that people are able to identify those the losses and the feelings that they have around that. So many reasons why anticipatory grief is important, right? And one of the things that we can do when we have the time, when you lose somebody suddenly and a sudden traumatic loss, we don't have opportunities to say the things that we want to say right before they die, and that can present a whole other host of complications. But when we do have opportunity, when we have that advance notice, it gives a chance to say and to do those things, and it does affect people's bereavement. It certainly does. It's, how that person grieves is, certainly how that person's dying process goes affects grief. And I always say this to healthcare workers and I even, in a different way to families that, this dying process is so important. And, we have one shot at this, so it's got to go well. So when we tend to that and when a person's dying process goes smoothly and you're able to do that, I've seen it so many times in my career that, the people who are left behind, the bereavement is so much different and so much more enhanced in a positive way. So, as I mentioned too, that, this is not just about the what is right now, that this, these losses are being mourned for past, present, and future. Sometimes, this, I'm going to list these out. Hold on a sec. There you go. I think sometimes people think that when you're working on these things that, and coming to terms or acceptance, that I think people think that you're going to detach from that person. That there's going to be that loss, and there is a loss, and there is a withdrawing of that. But this, you feel like that you're not able to be present with that person. So there doesn't have to be that a sense of detachment that you feel, although there is a letting go that happens at this time. So you can grieve the loss of the loved one, about what the future is going to hold and not having them there, but you can still be with them, and that's important. So, we want to be able to recognize that, and you are going to grieve all the things that aren't going to be, but you also want to make sure, again, being there in the present as well, with that person, having the time that you have left. So, I talked about Teresa Rando, and, she talks, about anticipatory grief, and she, just outlines and details many of the aspects and the factors that influence anticipatory grief on individuals. So, she really, she talks about, having an understanding that anticipatory grief kind of comes from two different distinct perspectives, the perspective of the dying individual and also the perspective of others who care about them, whether it be family, friends, or other concerned people. So this anticipatory grief, and she says, has, three different time foci. So the past, and so that's what you have shared, right? And you already have shared with that person that can never be regained. The present, the losses that occur in our experiences, and but you could see that these are diminishing, right? As people's capabilities are diminishing, so you can see, and it's that people are experiencing kind of the erosion, if you will, of some of those things for that person's able to do or what you're able to engage in. So there's loss around those types of things. And then there's the future, the loss of the things that, again, you won't be able to share down the road. So I think that it's important, again, that we pay attention to all of those aspects, not just the what is today. So individual psychological process, too, that come in here. So, certainly awareness and gradual accommodation to the loved one's dying. So, through this process, you start to really understand that your loved one is dying, and you're trying to be able to prepare for this. When you're developing a deepening awareness of the serious illness, the realization about hope and recovery may not be actualized, right? So this is where you're really coming to terms that this is probably not going to happen. And so what people do in this stage too is, they can even start rehearsing how the death is going to go and what the consequences are. And even too, in this stage, you start to become a little socialized to the bereavement role, and people are thinking of that. Then you have the emotional processes. These come up naturally as you're contending with a loved one's dying and your feelings about it. So you're confronted with the need to manage stress and emotional reactions. And because sometimes they don't always jive with the demands of the loved one's terminal illness, right? This is where, again, you're mourning that past, present, future. You're managing and coping with the emotions and reactions to grief and mourning. You're dealing with or coping with separation anxiety, fears that are brought on by that threat of the permanent loss that is coming. So you're drawing on that emotional, energy. Even again, sometimes people imagine, what the future is going to be like, when the loved one dies, what the future holds for them, with hopes and dreams and wishes and expectations and all of that. And even recognizing that there'll be separateness from the dying loved one in that way. And so, it's important that, again, that, this is where, again, almost building some level of confidence, if you will, in terms of, preparing yourself for this sort of thing, even though it seems like you can never prepare, right? Even the thought process, things are going on, in people's minds as they face the loved ones dying, preoccupation with, concern for that dying individual. Again, slowly incorporating changes in your identity and role and your beliefs, assumptions, expectations. You just try to take it in, right? This thought process about what is going on, what this all means, what this, like you say, what's the future hold, all of that. Sometimes it makes us face our own mortality, contemplating what that our own ultimate death eventually will look like, and just how, maybe developing some type of a philosophy about how to cope with the time left with the loved one, and then planning for the future. Consider what is the future going to be like without that person. The other losses that we talked about, practical and social considerations that have to be addressed, like the financial and all of those things, roles and such. And what is that going to look like for people? It's so complicated, isn't it? So, there's the interactional process too, which is, it's broken down. It's the anticipatory grief involves numerous interactional processes between you and the dying loved one. So, you're preparing for the ultimate loss of the loved one through this anticipatory grief and, trying to finish or be aware of unfinished business between you. So by interacting them, you'll be able to hopefully finish this. It's a crucial part, right, of the anticipatory grief process. But this even has, separate process to it when you're trying to finish this unfinished business, if you will. So, this direct attention, energy and all. So, remaining as involved as possible, trying to avoid withdrawal and having that communication, being alert to their cues, paying attention to the physical, emotional, and social resources in caring for your loved one, trying to find a balance, right, between that holding on and letting go. It's responding to the loved one in ways that make allowances for their deteriorating condition, but also, not supporting maybe, even like defenses that they have. So it doesn't mean, I think sometimes it's like anything goes for when a person's dying, and even if they, their anger is starting to be directed at you and all, it's okay to have conversations around that. And not allow, you don't have to be treated badly or just always relinquishing to that these are things that, again, could be worked on. the resolving the personal relationships. This is where, again, finishing unfinished business, reinforcing what your loved one has meant to you, even recollecting like mutual relationships and shared memories, planning for your future, so with your loved one, right? So even this is where too, sometimes people will say, look at, I want you to, when I have died, I want you to, consider again moving on in life, having another relationship, that sort of thing. And that can help for people, like in terms of feeling like they're betraying their loved one, after they have, eventually down the road after they have gone. And also even with this, this interactional process is, appropriate time even to give permission to that person, to die when that's appropriate. Helping your loved one, identifying and anticipating needs of the dying loved one, right? Attending to the last wishes comes into play here if those are able to be managed. Really helping them, helping the dying loved one with their own anticipatory grief and mourning, right? This is where we got to promote open communication. Do what we can to minimize suffering here. There's suffering associated with dying and loss in so many levels, but this is where when we do different things, it can be helpful to that. This is where like life review could be so important. And life review is, how to, really kind of putting name to the things that we celebrate in our life and also the things that, we feel like need to be reworked. I life review, I think, is such an important body of work. I think it's so essential. Also even working with the loved one on how do they want to be remembered. I think that's very important. And what we think of ourselves sometimes is totally different from what others perceive us as, right? So I think it's always important to ask somebody how they would like to be remembered. Even the funeral and or rituals, or to do some pre-planning here. What would be important to that person? What would they like? It's good stuff to be able to do together. So, the anticipatory grief stimulates a series of family and social processes. So, the dying loved one has their place, right, in a social context, and that affects, their loss affects a lot of different things, their roles. So how to reorganize and how to refill those roles, who's going to kind of step in and do what they've been doing. And you have to, right? You have to step in. The mourners have to step into these new roles because of that incapacitation or, again, future absence of that dying person. And making plans, what is going to happen later in life after the illness? How are people going to do that? Negotiating relationships outside the family, networking with people, resources. And this is important, too, because, as you know, when you've lost somebody, and somebody has died, boy, you're really interacting with a number of different resources, right? Even like just having to, like with the getting death certificates, everybody's looking for. So there's a lot of networking. There's a lot of connection. There are resources that are necessary. And even working with like clergy or funeral people, making sure that a loved one's preferences are tended to around their wishes, around those services and all, is very important. So what can we do to help, right? Set a time aside. Set aside time for yourself. It's exhausting. This is exhausting work. So you've got to take time for yourself. And we don't do that. We're so focused on that individual with the life-limiting illness or who's dying that, again, we'll think, we'll take care of that later. It's really important that you do it now and that you have those rest periods. Make sure that you're aware of your own reactions and needs, because we often don't pay attention to them, and then things can blow up. We can get angry when we don't want to. We can just, we can even, again, health issues can even pop up, right, when we're stifling ourselves in all ways. what has helped you? Like I said, I think this is the helpful thing is to call on things that we've used in the past that have been so helpful for us. I think that, this is where there are those tools for the tool belt, right? To really call on those. What were they? What got you through that? If we can set aside, we make our own assumptions and expectations, right? And I think if we can put those aside, right, we have to just kind of focus on what is, because it kind of puts unnecessary pressures on us. And sometimes those assumptions and expectations are not even real or what should be, right? And that the emotions are going to increase and they're going to become more intense, and just finding that soft place to fall with those. It's, and making sure that you have your team. I really am a huge advocate of when people are diagnosed with a serious illness, we've got to form our team. We've got to have our peeps, who are going to be there for us in all different ways and in all different areas of our life that you can depend on in terms of helping to navigate this landscape. And again, we've talked a lot about this morning, about expressing those feelings as they arise. Don't let them accumulate because they can come out in really difficult ways. And again, knowing who you can share those things with too. That there are people in your life, some you can bare your soul to, and others that it doesn't work that way. They're more casual friends that you wouldn't do that with. But making sure that these things don't accumulate to that boiling over point. Exercise regularly, so important, right? And let others help. Sometimes we do it this go alone attitude, and it just doesn't work. There's always the number one thing that we can always do is not go it alone. Everybody needs somebody, and it doesn't mean that you're dependent or that you're weak or that you're unable to do it. I feel like there's a huge amount of strength that goes into allowing one another to help each other and to hold each other up. We all need it. It's not a weakness. I think it's a major strength to be able to pull on each other. Like we said earlier, we're pack animals, right? And we do it together. I think it's important that people follow like with caregiver support groups. Big fan of support groups. I think they're a huge thing, where you can be with other people everybody's loss is unique, but you can be with other people that have been through similar situations, and really call on, you can see just what other people went through. And I love it when people are at different stages, because you can see what was helpful to other people for them during that time. And maybe it would be something that could be useful for you as well. Journaling, very important. Even in palliative care, it's an approach that it focuses on improving quality of life for people with life-limiting illness and families, and it addresses the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual needs. It's excellent bereavement care should be available to support, before and after death. So it's important that, clinicians use anticipatory grief or similar tools to identify when caregivers are having anticipatory grief, rather than just focusing on like a caregiver burden or the emotional aspect. Sometimes, again, it can be missed, this grief period. You think, oh, they're just exhausted. Well, there's grief here. So let's not miss the grief period just because, we're focused on what a burden caregiving is. There's so much grief, and let's not miss that point. So it's, and then making time to say goodbye. As some of you who know me, I'm a big fan of Ira Byock. I love Ira Byock, actually. And he wrote a book called The Four Things That Matter Most, but he also talked about that there are, there's the important things that people who are dying and the loved ones exchange or say to each other at that time. And, it's I love you, I forgive you, forgive me, thank you, and goodbye. It just makes so much sense to me. It's, and it's so, when people have this opportunity to say these things, talk about healing. And again, I do believe that the bereavement is impacted greatly by having this opportunity to say the things that you need to say, when that person is dying. So other useful tips for coping with anticipatory grief, again, finding the support you need. I do think that anticipatory grief is not totally understood, so I think that you want to make sure that, and even some people minimize it, because of a lack of understanding. I always see this with people is that what we can't, people are afraid or they respond kind of differently sometimes to what we can't explain or we don't understand. It doesn't mean that it's not real because we have a hard time recognizing it or understanding it. So, sometimes, if people are not paying attention or not able to recognize that, well, make sure you find the people who do, who offer you support. Grief comes in many unexpected ways. Be prepared because, again, it can come out in different ways, and I think sometimes we're overwhelmed by it. So I think even now, I see that, people are kind of reacting to having, short-tempered or whatever, people are reacting differently during what we're going through right now even. And some people have additional grief on their plate in addition to all of that that we're experiencing during this pandemic. I think, we just have to be more gentle with each other and ourselves and expect that grief can just, rear itself in different ways, and it's not always expected. So, talked about, again, being kind to yourself, getting professional help if you need it, individual or support groups. Grief can absolutely be debilitating, and we want to make sure that we're able to get through that and you don't have to go it alone. So, it's love's ransom, right? Grief is love's ransom. We grieve deeply because we love deeply, and as hard as grief is, the alternative is not to have loved at all or not to have formed that attachment, and that's too big of a price in my eyes. So, that's why we'll continue to grieve, but let's get the support that we need. So I just want to check in. I want to see if we have any. I don't see it from my perspective. I can't. It's hard because, as we're doing these more remotely. I don't see any questions that have come in. I just want to thank everybody. Thanks for taking the time this morning. I know it's early, but we have a nice big group on this morning, and I want to thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. So, what you'll do now is when we end the webinar, the evaluation will be submitted to you. Please send it back, and then I'll send on your certificates. I'll have those out to you within 24 hours. And again, I'm so happy that you are joining us on the webinars, and I just thank you so much on behalf of Care Dimensions and myself, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.